China-Africa cooperation has often come under the spotlight since the inception in an institutionalized manner nearly 18 years ago. Under the watchful eyes of major actors in the international arena, bilateral cooperation has made important strides and developed a new mode of strategic partnership which attempts to shake off neo-colonial approaches to the continent. As both sides prepare for the next month's Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC summit in Beijing, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Liu Guijin, former Chinese ambassador to Zimbabwe and South Africa, Kuku Watuju-Tuzo, researcher from the Institute of New Structural Economics, Peking University, and Fathil Jafed Mpuniji, Sino-African Affairs analyst, to look at the state of China-Africa relations and its prospects for bringing together both sides' development goals and strengths to offer a new mode of cooperation in regional affairs and international relations. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Since its inception of FOCAC 10 years ago, generally, what has impressed you most about the alleged remarkable progress in improving our bilateral relationship between Africa and China? By Africa, I mean sub-Saharan region, right?
Well, FOCAC has been there for already 18 years, and since last FOCAC summit, that is exactly 10 years. And since 18 years, or 10 years, and I think a lot of changes in bilateral relations between China and Africa. First, mutual political trust has been greatly enhanced. That is why the partnership of the new type of strategic partnership has been upgraded into comprehensive strategic partnership, which means that China and African countries have engaged on all sorts of areas cooperation that has become much closer. And secondly, economic and trade relations has been greatly enhanced. And China has, for the past 9 years, been the biggest trade partner of Africa, and Africa, one of the major destinations of Chinese trade and tourism destinations. And thirdly, that our major economic issues and regional issues, and China and Africa have come into very close partnership, coordinated our positions, and expressed our strong joint voice, tried to improve the pattern of governance and the economic and political order, which make it more conducible to Africa and China as a group of developing countries.
There's no question about the benevolence of the Chinese political will concerning the prospects of the bilateral relationship between the dynamic continent and the second biggest economy. However, some of the Africans may raise questions about the implications of Chinese investment, saying, well, this is none other than market principles, making money at the cost of the environment, so on and so forth. So it seems we have had a complicated picture, more complex than what Ambassador Liu has prescribed to the Chinese and international audience. I'd like to have your thoughts.
It's quite common for any relationship to be complex. There are many issues which are involved. You may not be happy with some of them, but if you look at the bigger picture, many Africans would say that are happy with the way we deal with China. This is not the same as how we dealt with other partners in the past. We talk a lot about the win-win situation. So now if we see we are engaged in a cooperation which is not in win-win or which is doing damage to us, we discuss and we change. So if people think that, I mean, it is complicated, yes, complications are there. There are so many areas, for example, which are new, just open for cooperation. So there are things which just emerge. We don't know what they mean. Maybe sometimes even China does not have that much experience in those areas.
In what specific areas both sides are facing a lot more uncertainty concerning the practical cooperation, sir?
Actually, there are some problems in many African countries, like good governance. The good governance is a big issue in some French-speaking countries. If it was convenient for some African countries to follow the democracy that was imposed to them. And you know, it came to me like when the country, like take the leader of how to say, Rwanda, Kagame.
Paul Kagame.
Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame has been there for 2 terms, and then the people call him back because he was doing a good job for the living standard, for the welfare of the people.
Perhaps the policy consistency in the development strategy of some of the African countries, instead of having the electoral politics endless competitions, which may not guarantee necessarily sound investment environment. He put his finger on a very interesting issue of governance. That brings me back to one of the interesting articles of The Economist, one of the prestigious journals that I like very much, about the governance. Governance has a lot to do with the rule of law, corporate governance, or democracy. Now, China, however, says we don't care about your governance. We only care about the rule of law and how to make money, the return of investment in the African continent. What do you think of the Chinese concerns?
Well, I think Chinese do concern with good governance. I think the concepts of good governance and good management are important to every country, China included, African continent included. So now we are having...
What do we mean by good governance?
Well,
we ensure economic prosperity and improvement of livelihoods.
Oh yes, that is important areas. To guarantee a good governance, we need a strong and visionary leadership, a political party which delivers. For Africa, to enhance the capacity of governance is really important. And that's why China is willing, more than willing, to exchange our experiences in governance, in management, in economic development, poverty reduction, these areas. But that does not mean that we are trying to impose our model of development on Africa, but we are willing to share our experiences. In the final analysis, it's the African government, African people, African political parties who determine the fate of their own country. But China can help.
China is ready to help. There's no question about that. But the Trump cabinet, let me use the phrase of a cabinet, looks more like a wartime cabinet, surrounded by generals and ex-soldiers, right? And they single out China for bashing, saying the mode of Chinese development threatens to challenge American-led world order, to discredit American democracy, and to dismantle whatever that the Americans consider very valuable. So what do you think of their theories about China threat?
Well, you know, Americans now have to accept the fact that the world now is different.
The world is very different.
It's very different. It's not
you
like
respond very effectively to the concerns of Kishore Mahbubani, a renowned scholar from the National University of Singapore. He says the United States lives in a different era, in a different century, in a different world.
They're living in 60s, in 70s, which is not the case now. I mean, China is industrial power, so they have to accept that fact. And other countries are also industrializing, so the advantage that they had in 60s, in 70s is not there. So in my view, that they have to reform. If they don't reform, then they will have problems. No matter what they're doing now, if they come up with the funny economic policies of trying to isolate itself from other countries.
Don't worry, my friend. The United States always seeks regime change through the ballot box. So if they don't like President Trump, he can be kicked out.
Well, yes, it's not only about Trump. It's also about those who are in policy making, those who are in making laws. So it's so many things. They have to change so many things. They have to reform to go with the current world. I mean, the world is different. This is a fact we have to admit, not just pointing fingers at others for your weaknesses.
Thank you so much. Let's look at the issue of infrastructure. I was impressed by the 10-point proposal that President Xi Jinping put forward in Johannesburg at the previous FOCAC summit. This mega project aims to assist with African countries in their massive industrialization. Ambassador Liu, do you think Africans are ready for the massive industrialization. It means cheap labor dividends, low value added at the cost of the environment. Well, given the hindsight wisdom of Chinese development, we achieved so much and lost so much.
Well, I think personally that infrastructure and industrialization are closely linked, two important factors. And for Africa now, there are three constraints in the economic development.
Mm-hmm.
One is lack of good infrastructure. Another is lack of enough financial resources. And third is lack of skills or compatible people. And in all these three areas, Africa actually are making progress, big progress. Well, I think they are getting ready. At least certain countries are getting ready for industrialization. For instance, in Eastern Africa, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and in the sense Kenya and Tanzania, they're well prepared because the African Union as an institution on the continent have worked out African Union agenda, Africa Agenda 2063. It laid out overall plans for infrastructure, for industrialization, for modernization of agriculture. And in all these areas, China could extend a helping hand because we have gained very rich experiences in industrialization, and we have good production capacities, and we have skills which are adaptable to the African continent. So in this area, we could promote what we call production capacity cooperation, and to move all infrastructure, particularly industrialization, machinery, kind of technology or ways of management into Africa, and to come into joint ventures and good corporations with African government. And for Africa, for the government, and they need to get their grant levy and to make more preparations. And on law, on regulations, they should also be in a good progress so that they could benefit from the transfer of technology and of manufacturing sector from China to the continent.
Thank you so much. You're watching Dialogue with three distinct guest speakers addressing the issue of how to look at the future of China-Africa relationship and our business opportunities in this dynamic continent. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. You are watching Dialogue with Ambassador Liu Guijin, former Chinese ambassador to Zimbabwe and South Africa, Mr. Koko Watujo Tozo, researcher from the Institute of New Structural Economics, Peking University, and Fathil Jafad Mpuniji, Sino-African Affairs Analyst. Welcome to our discussion. In the second half, I'd rather focus on the financial muscles China flexes. Now, what are the banks or financial infrastructure, financial institutions that may help with your financing vehicles at this moment?
Well, since China started the China-Africa Development Fund, there has been channels in African countries that China can channel these funds to our banks. We do have good banking systems in our countries. They are very stable. But the problem that we have is some people are not prepared to receive those money from banks. It means that they don't have the capacity to borrow and to ensure that they will return those money to banks.
Credibility,
yeah,
would be an issue.
Yeah, this is an issue which needs to be addressed, and I do hope that it's one of the issues which will be discussed in the coming summit.
Again, we come to the issue of governance. Without the good corporate governance, no major financing institutions such as IMF, World Bank, or ADB, to say nothing of AIIB, would reach out to those who are badly in need. Now, what can be done to improve the credibility and the governance of African banking industry so that you can have easy access to loans?
If you get loans, you need to use these loans for the people.
For the people?
Yes. Use the loan for the people. But actually what we are seeing from these leaders is a kind of corruption. It's not even a kind of corruption, it's corruption.
But President Pope Kagame might be a good exception.
Yeah, thank you.
His government is known for integrity.
Yes. So I was talking about this president, who is a good example for its peers, African leaders. You may be a dictator, or people may call you a dictator, but you can be a good dictator.
A benevolent dictator.
Yeah, and we like to have this kind of dictator in Africa.
But the issue is, in the post-Cold War era, most African countries have been transformed into democracies, which mean they have independence of the judiciary and independence of the media crusade against the government to supervise behavior of the government. Why do some of the African governments still have this chronic problem of corruption under the scrutiny of the media and even opposition in the parliament?
You know, Africa is quite different from other regions, other continents. We have our leaders, and these leaders, they have issue governing the country because some outside forces are backing wrong leaders to govern the countries. So this cannot work for the people.
We see some of the proxy wars in Africa, such as the one in Yemen and Syria. But what about the role of African Union?
I think the African Union has actually done a lot in trying to prevent wars and to solve or resolve conflicts and for the post-conflict reconstruction. But the continent has its quite a special history because it was ruled by the colonialists. Those colonialists, though, were driven away, and all of the African countries gained independence, but their influences are there. And they are still trying to interfere with the internal affairs of the African countries. That's why the continent has so many conflicts, armed conflicts, bloodshed, wars, or tribal conflicts. And if you read carefully, those conflicts, you would normally have found that there are someone behind. And I think that will be given time. And I think the general trend for Africa is that the continent has become more peaceful nowadays as compared with maybe 10 or 20 years ago.
Do you agree that behind the major conflicts you see shadow of the overseas forces, Western governments, or do they come from Asia?
Well, like the ambassador said, that most of conflicts in African countries were either supported by Western countries or remnants of the structures or treaties which were left by Western countries. Like you said,
due to the colonial history.
Colonial history. But now many African governments are doing their best to make sure that we have peace. We are preparing the ground for development. But also it is a little bit of mispresentation to say that Africa is rife of conflict. That was something of a decade ago. Now, to large part, Africa is peaceful. We have hotspots, maybe in Libya or in South Sudan or in Somalia, but generally we can say that the continent is peaceful. We only have a few hotspots, which I do believe that not very long time they will also be dealt with.
It is politically correct to say that China should also learn from Africa, at least in the area of football. Look at the underperformance of the Chinese football team, and we never made it to the world tournament. So what can we learn?
Yes, of course.
Football education?
Football is one area, and music another area.
Oh, music.
Dancing, yes, and dancing.
And
also painting, rock painting. And Africa is the origin of the human civilization. Africa has more longer histories than any other countries in the world. According to gene research, and all human beings are related one way or another with Africa, because they originated from Africa is one of the main school of source. And in addition to those areas, and we also need to learn a lot from Africa, because African people they're happy people, and they're open-minded, they're inclusive people, and I mean, they are very friendly people, and many of the African people are working hard, they're good at learning, and a lot of good spirits we need to learn from.
Well put, well put. Yes, indeed, we can draw a lot of inspirations from African examples, such as Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
Following the end of the apartheid in South Africa, he called for national reconciliation, and the democratic institutions quickly took root in that country, despite some problems with their economic governance. So years on, with the end of racial discrimination in South Africa, and with the economic success of Rwanda after the massacre, what can we learn from the African spirit, sir?
We African, we are still learning, and we acknowledge that no one can know everything. So politically, what China can learn from African is looking at the great leaders that we have by the past. You mentioned Nelson Mandela, one of the greatest that we have, and
for example,
this ability of Mandela to unite the people, to unite different races, is a good example for China. But I think China is...
But I'm afraid the newly elected government in South Africa runs the high risk of causing instability, since one of the presidential vows is to deprive whites of the land. Will this threaten to disrupt the law and order in South Africa, which serves as a very good source of inspirations for development in the sub-Saharan region?
First, I don't think that they are depriving them of land. I mean, it is a policy which has been debated.
I've heard media reports that the newly elected president will do that.
Yes, we'll do that, but it's not just land grabs. I mean, there'll be discussions and people will be
There'll be a parliamentary
compensated.
debate.
Yes, people will be compensated. But we have to also admit the fact that that land belongs to South Africans, not to foreigners. You cannot just come and grab my land and then expect me just to keep quiet. So
but I'm afraid
I'll get it back.
deprivation of the whites' land in Zimbabwe, for example, was a wake-up call for economic inconsistency, if not chaos. Last but not least, in Guangzhou, we see growing number of African immigrants. Some of them are illegal. However, some Chinese football fans suggest, why don't we recruit Africans to be part of the national team, so that we would, very much like the French team, win the next World Championship, since Africans performed wonderfully.
Yes, it's a good idea. But
it's a good idea, right?
Yeah, but before I respond to your question, I would like to add something. That what you heard from the media report about South Africa's land reform is actually true. They are in the stage of revising the constitution, revising the constitution. But to get it in a constitutional way, there will be conditions on land appropriation by the government. I think they must have bought clearly the lessons of Zimbabwe land reform. And some of the self-media in China are even predicting that South Africa likely to be the second Zimbabwe. My personal opinion that now is not the time to talk about. We have to watch. And we believe that the new government in South Africa could be wise enough and try to get the land reform in an orderly way, and do not make sure that the land reform will not impact on the economic and social development. Maybe they could find some ways out, some balancing measures, try to address both concerns of the landless people and the need for keep the economic and social development.
Thank you so much. Despite cultural diversity between China and Africa, football remains a universal language that will help unite the two continents, the two sides, in their consensus of building co-prosperity and sharing community of shared future.